Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, it can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on one, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll see if I can get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, I'm going to have Jordan joining me from Rolling Fork, from Wayward Cask, from Fortuitous Union, whatever you want to call it. They make a whole lot of different things, and we have a really fun conversation. All right. So this morning or afternoon or evening or whenever you happen to be consuming this, I have Jordan joining me from multiple companies technically, right, at this point, or at least multiple brand lines. Jordan, I'll let you introduce yourself. I came to know you guys through the Rolling Fork Rum line, and then you've kind of expanded since then. So give me the elevator speech on who you guys are.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. So I would say Rolling Fork Spirits is kind of the parent company. Most people know us through Rolling Fork Rum. But under Rolling Fork Spirits, there's also now Wayward Cask, which is, Calvados and Armagnacs from France. And then recently we relaunched Bourbon Deluxe, which was that, Prohibition-era label from American Medicinal Spirits that we picked back up when Jim Beam, abandoned the trademark a few years ago. And so we recently relaunched that brand under the Rolling Fork Spirits portfolio as well. So I'm Jordan. I'm one of the founders of Rolling Fork Spirits, and I'm also the blender.
So, you mentioned this here, and I was going to be one of the questions, but Bourbon Deluxe being the kind of the most, is it the most recent? It feels like it's
it is the most recent.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew the Armagnac and the bourbon were real close together, or at least it felt like it from the marketplace. Were you guys keeping an eye out for any brands that might come to the marketplace, or was it just a fortuitous moment where that happened to hit the marketplace?
It definitely wasn't a lark. So my business partner Turner, his family is the Wathen family, which, if you read through the history of Kentucky bourbon, they trace, I think the original distillery was the Rolling Fork Distillery, hence her name. I think it was 1788. So I think it was actually a land grant from like Virginia. I guess Kentucky was 1792, right? So
Yep.
It was in Marion County, Kentucky, what is now Marion County, Kentucky, and it was on the Rolling Fork River, which the Rolling Fork River still exists. It's I think it's like dry now, but it still is a depression in the landscape with a bridge. So, but at the time they built the distillery there, it was, a river. And as most people know, kind of the classic way of distillation is you put it next to a body of water that you can use for, driving your condensation medium. So to cool down your alcohol vapor. So that was the original distillery. So his family, bought and started a lot of brands kind of starting in the 1800s and going post-prohibition. His family then sold to National Distillers, which National Distillers then rolled into Jim Beam, most of the brands. So if you look at his family and the brands they had started / acquired over the years, especially when they ran American Medicinal Spirits, they at one time the Wathen family controlled, I think it was like 60% of whiskey in the United States. Now it's not saying, it's saying a lot, but it was also because of Prohibition, right? So there were only, I want to say 4 or 5 people allowed to bottle.
Yeah, there's like a ton of consolidation during that time.
Yeah, so
that's how they survived.
They consolidated pretty much all of the whiskey space. And so every whiskey label that survived Prohibition was, I think, bottled under American Medicinal Spirits. Maybe there's a few outliers there, but you'll go like Old Grandad, Old Taylor, Bourbon Deluxe, clearly. Let's see, what else did we have? There was a few more. I think Crow, even Old Crow maybe was under American Medicinal. They also had some of the old, Pennsylvania Rye, like Old Overholt and things like that. So, Sunnybrook, Hill and Hill, all those guys. So it was just kind of American Medicinal Spirits was a big conglomerate. They had a lot of labels. And over time, those labels sold, traded out, got consolidated in. And one of the old labels was Bourbon Deluxe. It was actually started by a bottler in Texas, I want to say, and then acquired by the Wathen family and rolled into American Medicinal Spirits during Prohibition. And then after that, like I said, went to National Distillers where it was just kind of, that was probably its peak as a brand, was under National. And then it passed to Jim Beam. Of course, Jim Beam has a huge whiskey portfolio, the crowning jewels of which are Jim Beam. So, and, even Old Granddad was, kind of one of their pinnacle brands. I would say that's where Bourbon Deluxe kind of made it to that lower tier of whiskey. And eventually, strategically, I think Beam was just like, we don't need this brand. Right. And so, Turner and I talked, we always wanted one of the old family labels, but it's like, well, a lot of those still exist today. Credit to the brands they started. Like, a lot of those are not abandoned. Like, Old Granddad is still a very popular whiskey. Old Taylor, is still a very popular whiskey. So you can't just go around and like revive one of those brands. They still exist today. Bourbon Deluxe recently, within the last, say, decade was, kind of off the shelf, and the trademark was abandoned. So no one was using it. And it was one of the, top 10 on the list of American medicinal spirits brands that we thought were just really cool. I mean, it has the vintage Knight, it has like the Knight's crest and everything. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the marketing of Bourbon Deluxe back in the day. Cause like the old Prohibition era bottles just had the funniest thing. Like, one of their taglines was "Glorious Sunshine of 1,000 Ages," which I'm not sure. I was like, okay, like, I don't know what that means, but they had that on the bottle. And then they also had "The Zenith of Possibility and Whiskey Quality," which was also pretty slick. So you'll notice on our bottle, we managed to maintain both of those. The TTB was like, yeah, those are fine. Some of the other old school wording did not pass muster these days. They're like pure quality and things like that, which the TTB is like, wait, you can't say that. But in reviving it, we tried to maintain as much as we could, especially from that Prohibition era label. So if you look at our label and you compare it to what was originally launched and the Prohibition bottlings, it looks very similar.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does, and it was, it's one of those things that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to what was happening in the marketplace, and when it hit, I was like, it was a label that stuck in my brain of like, I've seen this before, but it's been a while since I've seen this. Yeah. I've lived in Kentucky my entire life, and so I've ran the gambit from the bottom shelf to the top shelf and then back down again because some of the better whiskeys were down there. In the old label really felt like it belonged on a table at like medieval times, right? Where they do the jousting and all of that.
It's a funny label for sure.
Yeah, but I think that's what made it fun. I think is it didn't try to take itself too seriously. And you say the taglines where they came up with. I mean, I don't know if you've ever watched Mad Men, but it may have been the end of the day after drinking. So
this was even earlier. This was 20s, which is is an interesting time to be marketing whiskey.
For sure.
Yeah, so we were super happy when that one went abandoned. Like, that was kind of one of our. I mean, Old Granddad's never going to go abandoned, right? Old Granddad is the staple, but like of all the brands out there, I was like, oh, Bourbon Deluxe is an amazing brand, right? It's got great history. We even dug up some of the old like whiskey ads. They had hired. This would have been during the National Distillers run. They hired Peter Arno, who was the famous like illustrator for the New Yorker. I think he has illustrated the most covers of the New Yorker. He did all of their like ads. So he drew cartoons of people like saying, if you want the finest bourbon, you want Bourbon Deluxe and things like that in like the 40s and 50s. So we have, acquired quite a few of those ads. They were in like Esquire and the New York Times and stuff back in the day, but it was definitely one of National Distillers' big brands.
So, and we've talked about this a little bit, and I know we'll probably come back to it, but I think the beginning of this story for me is like you've got a Wathen name, which is immense within the bourbon industry, and your first product line was to get into rum, and then there's the rum rye situation with Fortuitous Union, then there's Armagnac, and the last thing you bring in is bourbon, right? Like is this like an intentional like, I want to make my name in spirits, but not cash in on my legacy? Or like, what was the reason why you're like, let's just do rum first?
I wouldn't say that. Kind of the way we started the brand and what we were bottling is like, we always wanted to offer something different.
Mhm.
We're small, we were like, we're small and scrappy. We're never going to compete with the big guys on selling the same thing in a different package. Now, mind you, when we had that premise, it was 2016, and we were like, no one in the world needs more, the same whiskey in a different package. Clearly, we were wrong. There's plenty of the same whiskey in different packaging now.
Right.
So I wouldn't say we were smart about it, but that was our premise.
Mhm.
But we always wanted to offer something different in the marketplace, something we thought was underrepresented, but also high quality. And so that's why rum
Mhm.
was our first one, is because like in the US market, it is not an appreciated like ultra premium class spirit. Now
Mhm.
that's very different if you go to Europe and you like, browse a spirits list. The rum section of like a spirits list at a fine, like restaurant or hotel or something is insane.
Mhm.
And that's because they've just had a long history of like well-aged rums. But in the US, rum's always taken a backseat to, first Scotch, then bourbon, Japanese
Mhm.
whiskey. Of course, there have always been like cognac drinkers as well. And honestly, like if you rewound to like 2017, 2018, people were like, rum's the next category. But dark horse out of nowhere was agave.
Mhm.
Tequila and mezcal actually like just like whatever
Right.
momentum rum had was tequila and agave caught. And honestly, they've eaten, everyone's space since then. Like if you look at the
Mhm.
growth rate of those, which makes sense. It's, if you think about the US, you think about the demographics of the US, you think about the geography of the US, like Texas, Arizona, California, massive
Mhm.
populations and warmer climates. They love tequila mezcal. So the rum premise was not to be different or stubborn. It was just like we wanted to offer what we thought was underrepresented on the market, but still high quality.
Mhm.
That was the same case with Armagnac and Calvados. I mean, if you poll, it's an industry thing. Like a lot of industry insiders freaking love Armagnac and Calvados. I talk to
Mhm.
distillers, large whiskey distillers, rum distillers, like, oh man, not what I drink when I go home. It's Armagnac and Calvados because it's just so cool and so esoteric. It's not a big mainstream category, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one is the production is just tiny. You I mean, pragmatically speaking, the first time I went to like Gascony was going around Armagnac, you know, cellars. I expected to find something the size of like a small mid U.S. distiller,
Mhm.
right? A few thousand barrels, like pretty good production. That is one of the largest producers in Armagnac that I know. I was talking with them. And they're like, if we put everything we made this year into a barrel, we would make 70 barrels,
Right.
and that's one of the largest. It goes down from there. So the reason Armagnac will never be a huge category in the U.S. is there's not enough supply of it.
Mhm.
You know, that's just the way it is, and I'm kind of fine with that. It's an amazing. It is the most amazing and historical and like esoteric spirit. It's one of the best you can have on the market in terms of quality. It's crazy. So,
Yeah, and I think I agree with you wholeheartedly, right? I
uh,
spent a little bit of time digging on Armagnac a little while back because I kind of felt like as a whiskey drinker who gets tired of drinking whiskey, right? Like you drink
mm,
bourbon, you drink, even American single malt. It's not that it's all one note, but you're drinking some of the same flavor profiles and the same
yep,
here in the United States. And Scotch is already its own thing. And if you're a bourbon drinker looking for the next thing you can jump into without like having to learn all over again. Like I felt like with agave spirits, I was having to learn
mm,
all over again.
mm,
Armagnac was kind of that stopgap. It was a place where you
yep.
can find some significantly higher aged product at reasonable
The
prices, right? If you come in
the
from
age and
buying,
quality to
is
price
amazing.
ratio is insane.
Hmm.
Like I think we sell a 24 or a 20. We sell a 25-year Calvados for $149,
Right.
which at cask strength, it's I don't know of another spirit you can buy a 25-year-old spirit of at $149. I mean, what is like 10-year-old bourbon is now $149.
Yeah,
So
it'll be $100
yeah,
at the bottom end unless you catch somebody who's been doing it for a long, long time.
hmm
And you might have been able to sneak into that with light whiskey a handful of years ago, but that's really not going to happen anymore. You're still going to be
yeah,
close to that, $10 per year, maybe $7.50 a year, but it's
Yeah.
beyond the pricing of it, it's still a phenomenal spirit that has flavor profiles that are similar enough that you're not having to learn a new flavor wheel, but you're having to add on to the one that
Yeah.
you already
Yeah.
sort of know about, right? And
It's and the history of it is incredible.
right,
I actually told my French counterparts when I went over there, I was like, the history bourbon wishes it had.
right,
Because
but
like people romanticize bourbon and then they come to Kentucky and like it's industrial. Like
mhm,
we're ripping millions of gallons of
right,
whiskey, off 54-inch columns or whatever. You go over there and it's farmers growing grapes and making,
hmm
20 barrels a year. It is very, very craft level.
yeah, and I mean it's a difference in history specifically, right? Like
Mhm.
where you go over there and you go into a farmhouse that existed before this country existed,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
we're looking at it at scale here of they've been around longer, they've kind of been through some ups and downs with it,
I've got a
and it's
got a
probably
great
settled where it's
story on
going.
that if you want to hear it. It's just
Go
kind of an
ahead, yeah,
aside.
absolutely.
So going into a cellar, I meet the producer. His family has run the cellar for 3 or 4 generations, right?
Hmm
Maybe 5. And so, you sit in their kitchen and you talk with them. And, my French is not great, admittedly, but, I do okay. And they keep asking if do you want the house Armagnac? And so, I'm thinking like house, when you go to
Right,
France, you
house
say, I
wine.
want the
You're going to
house
house wine
wine. It's just
immediately.
like, it's
Yeah,
a red, it comes out in a decanter. And so it's like, oh, this is just like their standard Armagnac they drink at the house. It's like, I'll take some house Armagnac. Let's see what you're doing. And then they bust out a bottle and it is the 1898 vintage, which means the grapes were harvested in 1898. And I was like, whoa, 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 like, I was not asking to drink your 1898
right.
vintage Armagnac. And they're like, no, no, you're a guest in the house. They're like, you only get one pour. That's it. For your entire life, you will get one pour of this in our house. And I was like, oh, that's very sweet of you. And
Right.
so I was like, I got to know the story. Like, how
Mhm.
in the world do you still have 1898 vintage Armagnac? And so the producer's like, my grandfather, he was the cellar master at the time the Nazis invaded.
Mhm.
And so, like, when they knew the Nazis were invading, all the Armagnac producers they bottled everything they possibly could and they hid it because they're like, the German army drank everything. Like,
Right.
they told me, like, if you look at our inventory and cellar list, there's this giant gap where there was the German occupation where they just drank everything out of the barrel. It doesn't exist anymore. So everyone that could bottled as much as they could and hid it. And he's like, and so we call this our house Armagnac because my grandfather hid it in the walls of this house.
Wow.
And he's like, so as we've renovated, and like done updates and everything, he's like, every now and then we
You find
find a
another
few
bottle.
bottles of this. So it's the house
Wow.
Armagnac. I was like, okay, that's a very different. I thought house wine, house Armagnac. I was like, it's a very different translation of, what you were getting at. So,
The most literal version of it that could
eh,
exist, right? Is
yeah, it
this
was
is
a,
was in the walls of the house, and it's amazing to be able to have that kind of an experience, right? Because what around here lasts that long, right? Like
yeah,
it's a
it's a,
whole other creature.
highly recommend. All of my spirits industry people, I tell them like, look, when I'm going to Armagnac, I'll let you know it's an incredible place to go.
Hmm
They're incredible people. You meet the producers, you understand the families and the histories. It's something else, honestly.
Honestly, you could probably sell a seat next to you,
I
and
actually thought
fund
I was like,
your
man,
trip by taking someone with
well,
you.
I was like, I don't know why I'm running a spirits company. I should just run a tourism company. Like,
Well, I
let's
mean,
just go
if
drink Armagnac and eat duck. Like that sounds
right,
way
yeah,
better
or
than
or maybe you're gonna go and you're gonna pick up some rum in a Dominican
yeah,
situation or whatever. Like
yeah.
you've got all kinds of places you can be going here, and taking folks on some beautiful places and trying some beautiful spirits. And there's a bunch of people that'll pay a lot of money for that, and so it's a business
It's
expense
it's
and a
not my
revenue
worst
stream.
business. My worst business idea was trying to sell rum in the United States. I actually think the tourism company is a better business idea than that. So
Right. Well, I mean, it's a good rum though. I'll say that. At least
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
really good rum. But you are right because I remember that time frame pretty heavily. Of people were trying to debate. Everybody's tired of not being able to get the bourbon they wanted, and so they're like, okay, well, what spirit is going to be
Mhm.
next? And I think a lot of people were in on rum at that point in time. But it feels like, and I may be off base here, but it feels like it built up the appropriate business model if you want to explore some of these other spirits that you don't think are getting an appropriate amount of attention. Would you be able to do Armagnac or Calvados at the same level if you hadn't gone through the experience of importing rums and doing all of those things?
Honestly, we learned a lot with rum.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of trial and error. The other thing is we built up all of our sales network,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so every product we've launched after that, every product line we've opened up has been incrementally easier than that first one, right? So could we have sold Armagnac and Calvados without having sold rum before? I don't think that would have been a good idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
We already knew our customer base. And
Right.
what I mean by that is people that were buying high-end rums are the same, they're the same people in that same demographic also that are interested in high-end spirits in general, right?
Right.
They probably have a great Japanese whiskey selection. They have a great Scotch selection. They have a great rum selection. So Armagnac and Calvados were a natural line extension
Mm-hmm.
because it is a very niche product, right? There's not a lot of production. It's not very well known among the people that do know it. They're very passionate about it. And fortunately for us, the Venn diagram overlap between people that are passionate about high-end rum and people that are passionate about high-end Armagnac, especially, it's pretty good overlap.
Mm-hmm.
Those circles are not separated very far. So I think to your point, we could not have done it having not gone through the trial and error and honestly trial by fire of selling rum in the US, which is very difficult. What's been comical for us is that selling whiskey is so much easier. Easiest thing of I was talking
It
with a
sells
good
itself
friend
at this point.
who's a distiller, and he was like, "Oh yeah, no, dude, you spent 7 years selling the hardest thing and making it into a
Mm-hmm.
business." He's like, "This is gonna be a cakewalk for you."
Yeah, and part of me says, but you also built the reputation for bringing
We
forward
did,
fine spirits, and you weren't just another
yeah,
NDP who bought up a label and put a story against it. I mean, you have a legitimized story. You've got you got the
we
genealogy
do.
to prove it. But there's several of those in the marketplace. How do I know that yours is good? Well, I've had the opportunity to try the rums that you brought forward, and
Hmm.
if I'm the person who's seeking new spirits, I've tried the Armagnac, I've tried the Calvados, and I'm working my way towards it. Like, okay, now, they haven't missed, right? They haven't missed
Yeah,
on the quality of what they're sending out, so it's an easy buy at that point.
and our other premise has always been offer great value at a great price.
Hmm.
I mean, I know some people are like, dude, $149 for a Calvados is not great price. And I'm like, well, it's a 25-year-old Calvados.
Right.
I try to scale my quality to the price. And so
Hmm.
with Bourbon Deluxe, when we relaunched it, we were selling 8-year-old whiskey that a lot of people were selling for $115. Our bottle's $64.99.
Yep.
We got some hate mail. People were like, why are you doing this to us? And I was like, that's my standard margin. Like I do that's how
Hmm.
I price my rum. That's how I price my army. Like it's my standard markup, and my business is built like that. And
Right.
I'm sorry if your business requires you to charge more, but I don't think that's fair, right? I'm
Hmm.
trying to sell a really nice whiskey that people open and drink for $64.99. The last thing I want is for someone to buy an 8-year-old whiskey and shove it in their basement like a collectible. It's
Right.
8-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon. It should be opened and enjoyed, and hopefully not treated. I mean, it's great if someone thinks it's a collectible,
Hmm.
more power to you, but that's not the point to me of, Kentucky straight bourbon.
Yeah.
It has
And I think
always been kind of that working class spirit.
there are some people, and I'm one of these people. I'll just go ahead and admit that, where every bottle I buy gets opened, right, and I taste
Yeah.
it, and especially for something like what you guys have, because it flies off the shelves really quick, and so being able to get another bottle of it is usually pretty difficult. It's the kind of thing that I'll drink a few ounces of, and then I'll hide it in the back of a shelf, right. I'm
Fair.
setting a surprise for future me, so whenever I go and I move something, like, oh hell yeah, I still have
But at least you've tried
so
it,
many ounces of
right?
this. Yeah.
I don't want to make so beautiful of a bottle that my 8-year-old whiskey becomes like a, work of art on the shelf.
Hmm.
Like, so I want to price it so that people feel comfortable. Like, I paid $65 for this. Like, it's good whiskey. You share it with
Right.
good friends, and like, yeah, I mean, it won't always be available, right? And people have
Hmm.
asked me, like, what are you going to do if whiskey prices go up? I'm like, I'm just not going to make any more. It's that
Right.
simple, right? Like, I would rather wait around and find the right whiskey at the right price to offer it
Mhm.
to consumers so they enjoy it, rather than like try to convince people to spend $150 on 8-year-old whiskey. That's just not, to me, that's not a great, I don't know. I'm a little protective of Kentucky whiskey, bourbon in general. And like,
Mhm.
if you look back at the boom and what started it, it was like good value. Like, that's
Yeah.
what started the Kentucky bourbon boom, was like people were tired of scotch. They were price exhausted, right? In Japanese whiskey, there's not enough volume. You're never going to have
Mhm.
like low end Japanese whiskey of super high quality, right? Any like solid Japanese whiskey is just going to be a few dollars more than a solid bourbon, simply because they have limited resources. It just
Right.
costs more to produce. So, like, Kentucky bourbon, we're in agricultural country. A lot of the inputs are not that expensive. A
Mhm.
lot of the oak is grown here, American oak. The barrels are made here. It can be a very cost-effective spirit, and I think that's what people like about it,
Mhm.
is that like you can get a really high quality aged spirit for a really, really good price. So you're not afraid to open and drink it.
Yeah, and it feels like at least the market's going the direction where it is actually going to support the business that you're trying to build. What it doesn't support is folks that jumped out there when some contract distillers were charging $4,000 or $5,000 a barrel. The
Yeah.
market's not going to make it, maybe not going to support that for much longer.
Well, I'm very like connected on a lot of random layers on, like, I deal with a lot of IBs in Europe, right? Because I
Mhm.
I bought a lot of rum. A lot of independent bottlers in Europe bought a lot of rum. So for whatever reason, I'm their
Mhm.
sounding board for whiskey. And so the funniest story I heard was during kind of the COVID crunch, right?
Mhm.
They were like, all the IBs were like, why is Kentucky straight bourbon so expensive right now? And so one of the IBs that I work with told, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but he was like, look, we have to blame the Australians. And I was like, well, why are we blaming the Australians? I have no idea. And he's like, well,
Mhm.
they're consuming so many RTDs right now
Mhm.
that they're scooping up all of the 2-year Kentucky bourbon supply, because you can label it straight on the front. And, they're aging it on the back of the can or whatever, and they're just cranking RTDs, and it's the middle of COVID, and they're killing. Like, the Australians are single-handedly drinking this out of like 2-year-old Kentucky bourbon. I was like, well, that's impressive. Number one, right? Because we got a lot of that. I don't know if it's accurate or not, but it was
Right.
definitely like, that probably wasn't the sole reason, but COVID was a weird bump where, people were drinking more RTDs, people were
Mhm.
drinking, bottled cocktails. And so it did
Right.
create this just like scarcity in the 2 to 5 year segment of whiskey, which then drove the price up for everyone. We sat that out. We wanted to start a whiskey label, but
Mhm.
I was like, I don't think I can make a solid whiskey at a solid price right now. So we just didn't.
Mhm.
Like, I'd rather just not participate in that market than, offer something at an inflated price.
Right, and then because then you're in the game of if you jumped out there and you priced yourself at $90 a bottle, and then you start dropping prices, is that because the cost of the inputs went down, or is that because you're trying to keep your
Yeah,
share of the
course
market and
correct.
you're dropping prices
Yeah.
because you made a mistake before? Because there's some brands that are going to have that discussion. I had Aaron on from Smoke Wagon a couple of years ago, and he actually
Mhm.
predicted about 12 months too early. He was like, the price point of between $35 and $55 is going to be a knife fight in the next year, right? Which it's going to be
Mhm.
there, I think, and I think we're hitting that right now. Um, but that's going to be a whole lot of people having to drop their prices down to get there, or make themselves a purveyor of fine spirits. I don't know which kind of direction you go,
Yeah.
but you
I
guys
mean,
have good.
we've tried, but there are definitely your price points and what is
Mhm.
offered in that price point. And like, if you're an independent bottler, you honestly cannot compete under $35. It's just, like, there's too many hands touching the whiskey. It's just, one of the big guys is going to make a better whiskey. under
Mhm.
35. That's just the fact of the matter.
It's an
Where
economy of
you
scale at
can,
that point.
yeah, there's a lot of things working in their advantage, including that
Mhm.
they made the barrel themselves.
Right.
Um, where you can compete as an IB is in that maybe next year up, really the sweet spot's like over $50, right?
Mhm.
That's where you can blend, you can select the right smaller lots and make something that is worth that premium.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, competing in the $35 price range, whew, that's a tough one, especially for an IB. By the
Mhm.
time you pay FET, you pay materials, it's like, well, I like doing this, but I'm doing it for free,
Right.
you know?
Right. Is
So,
it is it a
yeah,
vanity project or is it a business? And
yeah,
for most people, it's going to be a business. I mean, maybe somebody's rich enough to make it a vanity project, and it's just something to kill their lottery winnings with or whatever.
yeah. They'll get
Um,
tired of it though. It's
yeah,
a lot of work. So
right. And then they'll move on to maybe another spirit or whatever.
maybe
So
Armagnac.
you yeah, well, hopefully not. Right. And
No.
I feel like the Armagnac people, they're very friendly, but they don't advertise a lot. Like people that are into
Mhm.
it will absolutely tell you everything about it, but they're not going to come and be like, "Hey, let me tell you about this new spirit," because they also know that once the hordes descend upon it, then maybe the prices go up and they get kind of kicked out of the
Yeah,
market a little bit.
I think there was one written recently where it was like Armagnac is the new investment spirit.
Hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, no." Right? Like, that just doesn't help anyone. So I don't think it really picked up. Again, Armagnac's
Hmm.
just it's so small, like, I think it's hard to turn that into an investment spirit like Scotch or
Right.
bourbon.
The volume
Yeah.
doesn't support it, and if you were going to try to support it from that perspective, you'd have to started planning like 40 years ago, right,
Yeah.
to be able to have that situation. So you've used the term a lot, and independent bottlers, and
Mhm.
it's not a term that we use in the United States very
I know.
heavily with our
Yep.
production. Why do you think we're stuck on this NDP versus independent bottlers? Is it just like we think that's the American way? We're going to call it something different because they're effectively the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think too, a lot of the early IBs, I'm not accusing everyone, but
Mhm.
a lot of the early IBs in the US masked the fact that they were an
Right.
independent bottler, right? They roll out a still, or they'd say, "Oh, our facility or our family recipe of Iowa rye whiskey," or whatever you want to say, right? And then you're like, "Well, you trace back." It's like, "Oh no, that's MGP
Hmm.
rye." Um, Whereas a lot of the IBs in Europe come out of Scotch, right?
Hmm.
And it is a time honored thing to be, you've got Signatory, Alexander Murray, Barry Rudd and Brother. Like, there are these spirits houses that don't
Hmm.
necessarily only bottle Scotch. They bought, so like, I think the three I mentioned, maybe not Alexander Murray, but Barry Rudd and Brothers, definitely rum, cognac, Armagnac, predominantly Scotch, right? Because they're in Scotland. But like, it's a time honored business tradition there. You acquire cool spirits, you keep them in your warehouse, and your goal really, and this has always been our goal, was release something interesting and different, right?
Hmm.
I may sell you a rum distilled by Foursquare Distillery in Barbados, but my goal isn't to sell you something where you're like, I can't tell the difference. If that's the outcome, then like, what was the point for me? You
Hmm.
know, the goal is to sell you something different. So, for example, like the Scotch IBs, you'll see, people selling Macallan distilled Scotch that's never touched a sherry cask. It's like, I don't know what that, like that's very different than what I can get from the Macallan line. Or they'll sell, like I had one from Signatory that was like, um, I can't remember. It's one of the big houses that never does sherry casking. Like, we put ours in a sherry cask, and I was like, I want
Hmm.
to try that.
Right.
That's like a time honored thing, and it's not frowned upon, but they're very upfront about it, right? Like, if you think about Signatory, they're straight up, hey, this was distilled here, this was the casks, this is where we did it, and that's the tact we took because, like, I like indie bottled Scotch. It
Hmm.
offers that difference. You're paying a premium for it, right? Like,
Right.
a Macallan from Signatory costs more than Macallan. I know I'm paying for the difference, right?
Yeah,
I
I
want
mean,
to
and that's
try
why
what
you're
someone
paying the
else
difference
is
because
doing.
it is not
Yeah,
going to be Macallan. It's going to be some other thing, and
it's
it's
someone's
like,
spin on Macallan. And that's what I tell people is
mhm,
like, I want you to be able to tell where this came from, but I also want you to be like, this is just very different than what I've had from them.
right,
I
yeah,
think in the US, where it got off on the wrong foot was people were they're making brands and
Yeah.
pretending they were distilling, right? Or it was their, they had controlled
Hmm.
the entire production process. And so then, you have the writers come out and be like, oh, well, most of the stuff's from MGP and here and
Hmm.
there. And so I think they just, like, they coined the term non-distilling producer because these people are holding themselves out as distilling
Right.
producers until they were
Yeah.
caught. If you look on our labels, we put on the back, we're independent bottlers.
Hmm.
We're
And
very upfront about it.
and I guess it makes sense to differentiate those that go through a process of like custom distillation, where they may not be the distiller, but
Sure.
they're showing
Yeah.
up to Bardstown Bourbon Company or Whiskey House and saying, "Here's my mash bill. Here's the process. I'm paying you to distill it for me,
Hmm.
and then warehouse it for me, and then I'm gonna come pick it up." Which is still not the same thing as being a distilling producer, but it's also
Yeah.
not the same thing as being an independent bottler, right? Because
Yeah, we have this mixed term that we
Mhm.
sometimes we say we're independent blenders and
Mhm.
bottlers,
Okay.
right? And so you're like, if you're not running the stills, if you have your defined mash bill and everything, you're clearly maybe doing more than just someone buying barrels and bottling,
Hmm.
right? But you're not distilling it, right? You have your specifications, it's made for you. I don't know if there's a term in the middle there, but
Hmm.
we blend, like our rums and stuff, we blend into small batches. So I say we're actually independent blenders and bottlers,
Hmm.
which merchant blending was also a thing in Europe, and honestly for rum as well. Famously, the UK government was probably the largest rum blender at one point when they gave every
Right.
sailor, a tot of rum. But
Mhm.
that was also just prevalent in rum and in European bottling. So when we came into it, it was like a concept we were familiar with and fine with, but it was not widely used
Mhm.
or practiced in the US at that time. I think now, even in whiskey, people are embracing it. Right.
Yeah.
You have what I would call independent blenders, people, and they're admitting it on the label. They're saying, hey, it's 20% this, 15, they're like breaking it down.
Yep.
I think that's a strategy to take with consumers. So you're explaining to them, I'm
Mhm.
doing something different, right? This is not my grandfather's recipe that I've been making for 100 years. This is
Right.
7-year-old Tennessee, this
Mhm.
is 12-year-old Kentucky. I like that because
Yeah.
as a consumer, I get it. I'm not paying for Tennessee whiskey, or I'm paying
Mhm.
for your take on making a whiskey with those components, which is fine with me.
Yeah, and I think of, Lost Lantern and what they do with both
Mhm.
blending and independent bottling, and they call themselves an independent bottler at
Yeah.
that point.
The Pursuit
They're
guys as well do a great job
yeah,
blending.
and they're able to go out and find brands that I'm never gonna people in
Mhm.
Arkansas that I'm never gonna find that distillery on my own, but they found it, they tasted through it, and I build a level of trust with their palates. And I'm like, if they say this is going to be good, I'm interested in giving it a shot at this
Yeah.
point. And so, there's a lot of market there. But you mentioned blending there, and I guess between bourbon and between rum and maybe even Calvados or Armagnac. What is your blending process like? How do you develop a blend? Like, what do you start with a target profile, or do you start with the components and say, what can I make from this?
Usually when I start, right, my first pass I tell people is literally a yes or no.
Hmm.
Right. My Because what I'll do is I'll pull a lot based on specs, right? And I'll
Hmm.
have an idea in my head of, like, especially in rum, our Heart of Gold cocktail rum. It's a blend of Barbados and Jamaica rums. It's from, let's see here, West Indies Rum Distillery, Foursquare Rum Distillery, Worthy Park, Hampton, and Clarendon. So I've got five
Hmm.
components, right? I will pull lots of each because we age these in our warehouse, based on specs, right? Like, I'm going to need something in this range. I'm going to need
Hmm.
something in this range, right? And I'll also, like, one of our big components is what type of barrel it's in. Um, Especially for me, there's a very big difference in aging rum in a low char barrel versus aging rum in a high char barrel.
Hmm.
And there's actually a pretty big difference between aging rum in, like, what I would call the classic Kentucky rye mash bill bourbon barrel
Hmm.
versus aging rum in a Kentucky weeded bourbon mash bill. Like,
Hmm.
you, everything that was previously in that barrel influences the next spirit. And so what we'll try to do is pull, 5 or 6 barrels based on specs just to
Hmm.
start. And then what I do on my first round is try to eliminate half. Right. Like, let's just get out of this 30, let's get down to 15. And then the next pass is identifying what is the actual back, like which ones are close enough in the flavor profile that they're kind of the backbone, right? And
Mhm.
then if you're, and I think it was Jim McEwen at Brooklady that said this. He said, like anyone can blend a good batch out of good barrels. Anyone can pick a good single barrel. The true master can take shitty barrels and make a good batch. And so any
Uh-huh.
any blender that's listening will understand, like, really the true gem of this is where you hide a few bad barrels, right?
Mhm.
You and what I say about hide is you try to, usually a bad barrel is like too far in one direction. It's
Mhm.
too oaked, it's too astringent, it's too dry. And so you try to find your counterpoint in another barrel. You try to find something to balance that and get it back to the mean, or maybe it's two barrels to one, right? But you're trying to balance to the mean of what your target profile is.
Mhm.
And then you just also, you can hide a few bad barrels. You can't, if you take 20 bad barrels and make a batch, you're going to have a bad batch. Statistically speaking, like, I would love to tell you that it magically works out, right? And it becomes better. It doesn't. Like, the sum of your parts is the whole to some degree. But if you're tactical in what you select and kind of what, if you look at the flavor profile and what it's strong in, you can usually balance out something that's overpowered in one direction by picking two or three other barrels that are kind of opposite of it,
Mhm.
right? To get back to that mean. And what you're really trying to do is just make them almost neutral so that the rest of your blend takes over. So, for example, in one of our Heart of Gold batches, I had some barrels that tasted like jalapenos.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, kind of mineral and just like overly spicy to the point where it tasted like you were drinking like something washed in jalapeno juice. I don't know why. I think it was probably like a really high rye whiskey, maybe even a rye whiskey that was in there before that just took
Mhm.
on a weird turn. And that barrel made, my rum taste slightly like jalapeno washed. Um, that's not great for blending a cocktail rum, right? Like,
Right.
it's not going to go well in tropical drinks. So could I use all? I had a few of those barrels. I was like, I can't
Mhm.
use all of these in that batch, or that's going to taste like jalapenos. So what I did was I went for very, very hard vanilla sweet, right?
Mhm.
Vanilla and sweet to balance out like the very drying, slightly acidic, peppery notes from what I call the jalapeno barrels. And then blended it with others that were just directly in my profile that I was looking
Mhm.
for. You can get strategic about that, like, it all depends on what you're working with too.
Right.
There's only so much you can do in a blend, you like I said, if it's all bad barrels, you're probably going to make a bad batch.
Right, and I think that's the bad barrels is a term that folks that don't, and I'm not a person who works in the industry, obviously, but
Yeah.
people who don't work in the industry, when they think of bad, they're thinking of something that's gone rancid or is
Oh
legit,
yeah.
like bad milk. And what you're when blenders and distillers refer to bad, sometimes it's this has gone bad and we have to pour it out. Sometimes it's this is bad because it doesn't get anywhere near the profile that you're trying to target. And
Yeah.
so then you're really trying to, you're trying to mix, white and black together to get gray because gray is the color that
Yeah.
you wanted to begin with, right? It's really
It's
an
funny
artistic
too,
thing.
because a lot of the like quote unquote bad barrels are just too oaked.
Hmm.
Right, and, like, yeah, if I made an entire batch of 2 oaked whiskey or rum or anything, it would taste 2 oaked, but
Hmm.
in a batch, an over oaked barrel is actually great. You're like, "I know how I can get a hint of oak in this batch." Or I've
Hmm.
got one barrel that's just all oak. I can
Right.
blend that, I can get it to where everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, there's a nice warming note of oak on the end," and it's like, it's perfect. Could I sell
I
that
can
as
tell
a
you
single
exactly which
barrel?
barrel did that. That was very,
Yeah.
this one right here.
Yeah, it's not a single barrel, right?
Hmm.
Like, and it's got a ratio where you have to blend it out. But like, I actually love finding those like very polar one direction barrels. And like, these are really good when you need to move the needle,
Hmm.
right, in a certain direction.
See, and I've talked to quite a few folks that do blending through the course of recording this podcast, and I've had the benefit of being able to be on a couple of single barrel picks, and I never put this together until this exact moment talking to you today. Usually, when I go on a single barrel pick, I'm the guy at the end of the table that you probably don't need to pay attention to because I want the weird one, right? The
Hmm.
the the one that just is off profile. but then I've never kind of put together downstream when that barrel goes to someone else to use, whether it be to rum or scotch or whatever, that weird barrel that I want to pick is now going to make another weird barrel
It could,
for
yeah.
someone down the path,
It's
right?
very
Because
possible that weird barrel continues on as an outlier in tequila or rum or whatever else it
yeah,
becomes.
whoever buys that now gets this. And if you're dealing with a major distiller, you're buying a lot of barrels, right?
Mhm.
And so they're not going to be
Yeah,
like, oh, that was the weird barrel. This lot of 100 barrels that you just bought. It's one of them in there, and good luck,
yeah,
blender. In the future, you're going to get to find this.
yeah. Especially with if you think about rum and how, like, honestly, probably like agave and scotch as well. A lot of the producers, they're working at such scale.
Hmm.
They're not going through and looking at barrels individually. They're
Right.
being like, I need 1,000 barrels.
Hmm.
And the majority of the Caribbean actually uses, and this gets into the greatest Jack Daniels bourbon or not divide, because like the majority of the Caribbean's like, we use bourbon barrels for aging. And they're like, what kind? And they're like, Jack Daniels.
Yep.
And so then you're like, well, like, here's my argument. It's like Jack Daniels has gone through the trouble of following the process to be labeled Tennessee whiskey.
Hmm.
Like, give it, like, they want to be labeled Tennessee whiskey. I think it's their right. Like, that's Tennessee
Yep.
whiskey. So then that barrel to me is a Tennessee whiskey barrel.
Hmm.
It doesn't sound as good as bourbon barrel, which is why no one
Right.
uses it. But like when people tell me, "Oh, it's all Jack Daniels age," I'm like, "Oh, so it's Tennessee whiskey barrels."
No, and
Yeah.
as a proponent of the fact that Jack Daniels is bourbon that just doesn't want to call itself bourbon, that's perfectly fine. They don't have to, right?
I,
They
I
meet the
respect the game.
requirements.
They follow a separate process. They want to be labeled Tennessee whiskey. So like, why am I?
Exactly.
I'm not going to tell them they can't be.
Well, it's like the difference between straight bourbon, Kentucky straight bourbon, and bottled and bond, right? They're
Yeah.
all it's just a trickle down of the requirements, and they happen to meet the same things, but they're not submitting themselves to anywhere in the market as a bourbon.
Yeah.
Where the kind of the rubber meets the road is where you have a brand who makes a Tennessee whiskey and then decides to come out with a bourbon, and they don't really change anything. They
Yeah.
just put bourbon on the bottle, and TTB says, "Yeah, no, you meet the requirements," and that's okay.
Yeah. Honestly, that's fair. I don't like. We've defined our standards of identity, right? And
Hmm.
we've written them in a certain way. Um, And, if you want to play the games on standards of identity, like, that's fine with me. If
Hmm.
people want it to change, then, call your legislature and yell at them about the standards of identity.
Yeah, and in probably 10 years we'll get an answer, sort of like the American single malt, right? Because
Yeah.
that took forever. So
American
we've
single
talked
malt
about
is super interesting category.
it.
If you look at
I
how it was defined.
I'm excited about it. There's only a couple things that me as a non whiskey producer would have liked to have seen be slightly different, but I also understand why it is the way it is, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of business built on it, and so I'm just the nerd over here on the side wanting a little more nerdiness.
Yeah. I mean, not to go off track, but I found it fascinating,
Mhm.
right? From the outside, from like, I deal with a lot of the standards of identity, clearly, especially in
Mhm.
the rum space. American single malt is the most defined of the American whiskey categories,
Mhm.
right? You can't age it elsewhere. I think you even have to bottle it in the US.
Yeah.
And they have a limitation on size of the container.
Mhm.
Whereas, I mean, there have been a lot of independent bottlers in Europe that have bottled Kentucky straight bourbon,
Mhm.
because Kentucky straight bourbon doesn't require it to be bottled in the US or
Just
aged
has
in
to be
the
made.
US.
Yep.
Has to be made and aged for a year. If you look at Kentucky state law, they want fermented or mash fermented and aged for a
Mhm.
year and distilled, in Kentucky. But federal law doesn't require that,
Right.
right? So if you're an independent bottler in Scotland, like, you could just be like, good luck, state of Kentucky. Like,
Mhm.
I'll see you in court in random XYZ jurisdiction.
Right.
But American single malt federal definition is actually pretty strict, you know?
Mhm.
So I was fascinated by that, and I wondered, like, is anyone gonna go around and update bourbon and, American rye as well?
I think it would be difficult to move.
Yeah.
I think you're gonna have too many large scale producers that are going to buck up if you try to amend the
Yeah.
existing rule, because if they get left out, if the Buffalo Traces of the world get left out of the definition slightly because somebody proposed it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah,
And to
yeah,
get everybody to move in the same direction on an already existing definition,
true.
whoever does
I
that is a peacemaker unlike any other, you know.
Well, I think the advantage of American single malt was it was a lot of small producers
Mhm.
providing input up front.
Yep.
So, and I don't think at previous generations we had that. We did not have that population of small producers that were
Mhm.
passionate about it.
Yeah, and I think it comes out of wanting flexibility that they didn't have with the existing American whiskey and some changes
Mhm.
that they wanted to make. And
I was
I
actually I was
go ahead.
really happy they went for used barrels, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
like that's kind of been the bane of American rye and bourbon to some degree. I mean,
Mhm.
bourbon's bourbon, I get it, new barrel, but like, why does American rye whiskey need a new barrel? Why couldn't you do something cool and different? Because we have this curse where we cut down all these trees and make all these new barrels, and we can only use them once, you
Right.
know. So I was like, okay. Thankfully, with American single malt, we can now at least use them more than once before we, ship them to
Mhm.
Scotland or Mexico for tequila or the Caribbean for rum. Like now, we get more uses out of our
Yeah.
materials. So.
Yeah, and it. I, I'm super. Like I said, I'm very very happy with the definition. I think it's going to be a great growth market. I guess. Are you guys ever thinking about getting into American single malts at this
No,
point?
I actually really like the category,
Hmm.
and I'm very excited to see what people do in it. To
Hmm.
me personally, I think the most interesting, and this is just me on my soapbox, is like someone who loves single malt and just is fascinated with the production process. I think the interesting question is now that they've allowed I think it's 700 liters, and it's also you can use used cooperage. Like,
Hmm.
there's going to be someone that does something completely unexpected.
Hmm.
I don't know what, they're going to use 600-liter, I don't know, sherry casks or something, and it's going to be really interesting. And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's just, I'm hoping it's just some small producer, just cranking away at American single malt, like doing their own thing. And in 10 years, everyone like, this is the best thing I've ever had. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I want to see, as an indie bottler and as a consumer, I really want the person to kind of crush the category. I want them to be like, someone that just cares and is passionate, is making something really cool. Um,
Right.
and thankfully, with our small, we have a lot of independent producers now. I'm optimistic that will be a really cool category moving forward.
And hopefully they do it quietly enough that you don't have a large conglomerate show up with enough money that you
Yeah.
can't say no, right? Because everybody has a price. There is a number
Well,
that comes into play.
it's interesting, right? Because this is not a knock on large producers, but large producers in the US, they have fallen in love with the column still.
Hmm.
It's more efficient. And if you think about the profile that people love from single malt, it's pot still.
Yeah.
And so I feel like even if a large producer comes into the space, if they're going to conquer that space and do really well at it, they're going to have to scale down their expectations.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to have to they're going to be forced to go more like small scale production if they hope that their American single malt competes in the category with Scotch and Irish
Hmm.
whiskey. And that's I hope that a pot still wins the space, because that
Hmm.
does just limit there's only so big you can make a pot still. There's only
Right.
so much you can do. And so I'm hopeful that like we see some of those like single malt producers that are that like Scottish distillery scale, right? Like, yeah, they're big,
Hmm.
but then you look at their numbers compared to an American whiskey distillery, and you're like, oh my God, they're tiny.
Yeah. The,
I
the
think I
idea
looked
of
up,
commodity whiskey is a very, very
yeah,
different story once you,
I
you
think I
start
looked up
talking about it.
Ardbeg makes 10,000 barrels a year.
Hmm.
Everyone's heard of Ardbeg.
Yeah.
10,000 is like, what, half a day of production at a lot of our large Kentucky bourbon distilleries.
Right.
So I'm hopeful. That's my hope. I would
Hmm.
love in 20 years to be right.
Well, and the thing is, there's so many twists and turns between here and there that it may go completely away from you being right, and
True.
then at the last minute, whip back into the
True.
right place. Because that's the way these
Yeah.
marketplaces go. And I know we're pushing up on time a little bit. Let's talk about any upcoming releases that you guys have going on here in the next handful of months, because that's ultimately the lifeblood. You do all the
Yeah.
work so you can put the bottle
Yeah.
on the shelf and then or on the website and somebody can come buy it.
Let's talk about it. So the question we get asked the most is when's the second batch of Bourbon Deluxe?
Yeah, I completely
So
missed the first one, so I definitely need to know this answer.
the first one was small.
Mhm,
Like I said, we've kind of focused on rather than hitting a certain volume or something, we want to hit the right price, right?
mhm,
So this first release was small. Second release, we have very nice whiskey as well.
mhm.
Going to stay 64.99 retail. It's going to be 8 years old. And all right, so I cannot claim credit for this at all. This is complete happenstance. I even said, what are the odds? I hit the exact same proof of the batch without even knowing it. So the first batch was 119 proof at cask strength, and I blend the second batch. So it went from 3 barrels to 6 barrels. So the second batch
Mhm,
is double the size, right? And I hit 119 again. I was like, I cannot. What are the odds of that happening?
mhm.
So it'll be 8 years old, 119 proof, 64.99 retail. That one should be, hitting the market early next month.
Okay.
Um,
And when you say
we
hitting the market, what does the market look like? Is this
so
online? Is
yeah.
this on premise? Is this
So our goal with this batch was to give a little more distribution without, 6 barrels is not enough to
right?
distribute to every market. So for the folks in markets we don't distribute to, or we don't have a lot of presence in, Seal Box will have it first,
Mhm,
right? It will make it into distribution in a few states. That was kind of our goal for this one. Is some of our better states for rum.
mhm,
Ironically, we're like, okay, like let's splash a little whiskey there. So Kansas, Missouri will have a little bit. Kentucky, Indiana will have a little bit. I can't say it's going to go widespread. Again, it's 6 barrels. And then we will probably also put a few cases on our website after
mhm,
it's all, like if we sell out and we got 5 cases left, we'll probably wait a month and drop it just for the heck of
mhm.
it. So that one, I would say you will start seeing it seal box next month, right?
And now, do you guys
Um,
have an email process or newsletter or
we
anything
do,
for the website? If somebody signs up and you're going to make a random Tuesday drop, there's an email that goes. I'm
we
not saying that this is what,
theoretically
but that
do.
yeah.
We theoretically do. I can actually not claim whether it works or not.
Okay,
So, but Sealbox also has their email list. So I would
gotcha.
sign up there for that drop. We will definitely send it. And
Mhm,
honestly, watch our Instagram. So our Rolling Fork Rum Instagram and our Bourbon Deluxe Instagram, we will definitely announce like the day before, hey, this is going to go
mhm,
live on this day on our website. That will be later than everywhere else. So if you miss out on your local market or you miss out on it on Sealbox, we are going to try to hold some back and announce ahead of time to people to follow us, like, hey, this day it will go live.
mhm.
We're trying to do our best to get it to people who actually enjoy it.
Right.
The other thing is in distribution, we're going to try to get it to, our good bar partners
Mhm,
because again, there's not a lot of it out there. We want people to be able to try it. Right. So in Louisville, we're hoping to land at a few of the nice whiskey bars, so you can go in and have a pour at least. So I would say April is when you'll see it start rolling out, and we
mhm,
might do our website release a little later than that.
gotcha.
That's release one. We do have a lot of single barrels of rum hitting the market.
Mhm,
If you're in, let me see, here, Texas is a big market, Kansas, Missouri, and then I don't know how much crossover you have, but also Bruzel has a very
mhm,
nice rum pick coming in. We just shipped it, so he should have a really cool pick in the coming months in one of his package deals.
gotcha.
Let's see here. So in our Heart of Gold rum, it's our cocktail rum, 101 proof,
Mhm,
should be reasonably priced. We just blended our third batch of that, which does up the producers in it. So we added West Indies Rum Distillery, which is in Barbados. We added a pure pot still from them, and we added Hampton pure pot still as well from Jamaica. So it's the same profile. A few more producers. We're trying to keep it consistent, right? It's
mhm.
hard to do when you're on a small scale to consistently source, similar rums that always hit a flavor profile. So, um, Armagnac Calvados wise, we will have a few very long aged Armagnac and Calvados probably, I want to say June. We don't do a lot of this per year. It's just, it's a niche
Right.
product. We love it. We like to release it. It predominantly online. It's not a
Mhm,
huge retail or distribution thing. It's just the volume's not there. The
right.
clientele is a little tough. So we have a 1982 Armagnac, a 1990 Calvados, as well as possibly some younger things. So those will definitely
And
be on our website and on Sealbox.
okay, your website and Sealbox.
Yeah.
Now, for your website,
Mhm.
what do you know what states you ship to? Or you ship to all of them, or
We do not ship to a few. Rollingforkrum.com/shop, and it lists everywhere we cannot
Mhm.
ship. I think there's 7 we cannot ship to.
Gotcha.
So, and when I say we have a third party fulfillment retailer
Mhm.
that handles all the logistics of that. So
Sort of like a big thirst kind of situation.
it is Big Thirst.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I've dealt with them on a few different things before,
yeah,
and
yeah.
specifically the reason I asked is because there were a handful of retailers that did ship to Kentucky, and then they don't ship to Kentucky anymore
Okay,
because things changed a little bit. And
okay.
for those of us on the west end of the state, sometimes
Yeah,
we can't get it online. We can't get it at an on
I'm a
premise or
Western
anything like that.
Kentucky guy, so I get it. Like it, once you get past
What part of
Louisville and
Western Kentucky are you
Lexington,
from?
I grew up in Henderson.
Oh, okay. So you legitimately are Western Kentucky, not like the Bowling Green Western Kentucky people.
Oh no, that doesn't count. Bowling Green is Central Kentucky. So
Right, because there's like I had this conversation with the guy from Casey Jones because he went to Western Kentucky University. I'm like, there's like 3 more hours of state west of there, right? Like
yeah,
because I'm in the Murray area, and so we're
okay,
we're we're out here.
yeah, yeah. That's what people don't realize until you try to drive across it. You're like, Tennessee and Kentucky are really long states if you're
They are,
driving east to west. Yeah.
and there's not a straight road to get from one end to the other.
No, no.
It's just not an opportunity. You're gonna go up and down a lot of hills and around some curves. Okay, sorry, I cut in on you. You've got
All
the
good.
Armagnac and the Calvados, the rum, the Bourbon Deluxe. Was there anything else or?
I mean, we'll have some more interesting things. I would say
Mhm.
definitely sign up for Sealbox. They have an
Yeah.
exclusive coming out. I won't try to describe it, but it'll be probably coming a few weeks after the 8 year. It's a pretty
Mhm.
interesting Bourbon Deluxe release.
Okay.
And they will be the exclusive for that. There just wasn't enough of it to make sense to distribute everywhere. So, I mean, you guys can, there's been a lot of premium whiskey bottled
Mhm.
lately. So we had the chance to do a premium whiskey and we did. It'll probably
Yeah.
be a one time thing.
Well, I mean, and there's still space in the market for premium whiskey. There's always going to be space in the market for premium whiskey as long as you're not trying to
Yeah.
build your whole brand off of that. Perfectly
That's
fine.
the thing. We had the opportunity to match like a current release to the original Bourbon Deluxe
Nice.
release. And so we're like, oh, that would be really fun to do once. So we
Mhm.
did it once. I have no plans to do that in the future. So yeah.
That'll be the thing that everybody will start being like, "Hey, when y'all going to do another one of those?" And it's going to get
Yeah,
real new
yeah,
real
it's not
fast.
gonna happen. First of all, like that kind of whiskey is not growing on trees, so that's the
Mhm.
first hurdle there. But no, it was fun to do once. It's an exceptional product.
Mhm.
So yeah, that will be solely on Sealbox again. There's just not enough of it to warrant
Mhm.
distribution or retail or anything. So we haven't even bottled it yet, but I would say it'll be under 400 bottles easily.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
yeah, so that'll be a thing to pay attention. So the answer to everything is Sealbox, Sealbox, Sealbox. Go sign up
And
there.
then our
Um,
website. Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah.
for sure. All right. Well, so Jordan, I really appreciate the time that
Sure. Yeah.
you've given me tonight. We'll absolutely keep in touch because I want to follow up. And if you guys do press releases on the releases as they come out, let me know. Thanks for tuning into this episode from the Embellish Podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you're consuming this on, and leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram at EmbellishPod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks for stopping by. For video versions, let's start this fucking thing all over again. That was awful.